Ocean Ice is the follow-on Horizon Europe program. So it's a great pleasure to actually have Andrew come and return to Tasmania and give us research activities, a whistle-stop tour, I believe.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Yeah, so thank you all for having me. And yeah, open-ended just means they haven't decided to fire me yet at best, which is probably a good sign, I guess. So yeah, today I'll take you on a bit of a tour of orchestra and ocean ice. So I'm an ocean physicist. I study southern ocean circulation and dynamics. And orchestra is orchestra is a project that's called part of the UK national capability, which is basically a bunch of the government-funded centres around the UK pooling their resources and putting together a project which is supposedly larger than the sum of their individual parts. And it was led by the British Antarctic Survey. It was initially led by Mike Meredith until I took it over about 3 years ago. It was followed by a one-year extension called ENCORE. And orchestra was really looking at the ocean regulation of climate by heat and carbon sequestration and transport. So ENCORE was effectively exactly the same thing with the catchier title. And so this was quite a large program. It involved 37 formal co-Is, but also many, many postdocs and PhD students. It was funded to the tune of around about £11 million, which doesn't include all the ship time, and had a very large field and ship component. So its general emphasis was looking at how the Southern Ocean regulates heat and carbon uptake in the atmosphere. Sort of in the name, and I don't need to belabor this too much here, I think. But the Southern Ocean, as I'm sure you all know, is sort of the key part of the global overturning circulation, whereby deep waters, can people see my mouse? Where deep waters are brought to the surface by a combination of buoyancy forcing and winds, and there it sort of breaks into two components, with one limb heading towards the southern part, around the Antarctic margin, encountering sea ice, brine rejection, and turning into dense, very dense Antarctic bottom water, cascading right down. And the other limb moving more northwards, and eventually encountering the northern part of the Antarctic circumpolar currents and low waters, and then heading into the ocean, into the subtropics. Okay, my screen's flickering, but yours isn't. And so orchestra's objectives were sort of threefold, basically looking at the holistic part of the overturning circulation. We were, due to very sort of UK politics, were given a strong steer to stay away from shelf processes, so this is very much an open ocean project, not looking at how it really interacts with our shelves, but sea ice is certainly up for grabs. And so we were looking at work packages, sort of split into three work packages, one looking at air-sea fluxes, so how does heat and carbon get across the surface and into the mix layer, which is where work package 2 really looks at the processes that control that interface between the surface mix layer and the deep ocean interior. And finally, work package 3 was really looking at the bulk of the ocean volume, how water masses mix from one to the other, where heat and carbon is stored in the Southern Ocean, and ultimately how it's imported and exported from the wider Southern Ocean. So we had quite a large field program. So this graphic, which sort of comes from a brochure we made, gives a nice overview of the scope of observation. So the red lines here are various cruise hydrographic sections where we took sort of full go ship. We're mainly looking at the physics, but then look at go ship level cruises. So we also look at the nutrients, dissolved oxygen, and additionally took lots of oxygen isotope measurements. So you can see that these orange lines basically divide the South Atlantic up into two large boxes. So this larger South Atlantic box with a line of 34 south in the north, and I6 south, which is this line that comes down from Africa to the Antarctic. And then this long line here, which travels along the northern boundary of the Weddell Sea. That one's called, that's known as the Andrax line, its first cruise, which turns this into a two-box system. So we've got the northern South Atlantic and the sort of southern Weddell Sea. And it's bounded by here in Drake Passage, it's the SR1 section, which is maintained every year and was done so as part of this project. And we have an extra line here, this is the A23 hydrographic section. It basically goes across the Scotia Sea, quite an interesting little area which is bounded by the South Scotia Arc and the South Scotia Ridge here. So it's sort of a quasi-Antarctic circumpolar current Weddell Sea interface. And that line goes right across that interface and into the Weddell Sea proper. And so the work also included lots of overflights by the Bass-Mason aircraft. So this is looking at air-sea interaction and fluxes. And so lots of very, very low flying out of the Falkland Islands and out of the Rothera Research Base to look at heat and carbon turbulent fluxes. We also made several, so the yellow dots here, process studies where we deployed ocean gliders, wave gliders, and a bunch of EMA-X floats with the goals of sort of this area here was looking very much at frontal processes in sub-meter scale, how basically changes in the wind change the mixo depth and processes, and how sub-meter scale actually acts to transfer properties, ocean properties across the fronts. Whereas this dot over here was looking at the presence or absence of tailor columns sitting over top of some of the really raised topography of the South Scotia Ridge, and whether or not it can sort of act as a sort of a washing machine, moving water across the ridge, effectively mixing between the Weddell Sea and North. And finally, we continued a very long-term mooring array that we have here, which is this white dot, which is basically sitting in the deepest passageway through the South Scotia Ridge, known as Auckland Passage, and it's where these deep waters, which is the green line, basically can move from their formation sites around the Ronnie Filshire Ice Shelf, through the Weddell Sea and ultimately out into the rest of the ocean. So we're monitoring that dense water formation. So I'll be talking about that in some more depth later. So just firstly, I'll take you to some highlights over the wider program. Because this includes so many people, I'm hardly expert on many of the aspects, and I'll talk in more detail about bits I know more about. But I mean, a lot of the experimental setup was to allow this sort of large-scale box inversion. So there's two Atlantic and South Atlantic boxes I was talking about before. The Weddell Sea box was actually done originally back in 2009, the original Andrex experiment. And so these are some of the results that came out of that. This is from Pete Brown at NOC. But effectively, because we're measuring the volume flux of the transport across these boundaries, which seals in the entire of the Weddell Sea, we can see what's coming in and what's going out. Hopefully those balance. And allow us to measure both the physical properties, so the heat and salinity, but also some of the chemical properties such as the CFS, so dissolved inorganic carbon, and the oxygen isotopes, which allow us to make inferences about the rate of melt or the contribution of freshwater melt from sea ice versus meteoric, so glacial ice. And so the goal of this next, so this is from the last time on the dome. It's quite a long lead time between actually making the observations and getting results out. So that work is ongoing at the moment, being led by Brian King and Yvonne Pyro at NOC. But we very much hope to see how the Weddell Sea has changed in these sort of decadal steps, and understand a lot more about the processes and pathways of this heat and carbon sequestration, and also the role of the biologists. So nice work that came out of this was the fact that you do not only have the overturning circulation we were talking about before, but there's also a very strong biological lateral component in the circulation acting to enrich the CO2, so the circumpolar deep water coming in and out of the Weddell Sea just due to biological drawdown. So that's things that we hope will come out of this. So while the project is formally finished, much of the science is still ongoing. Something that we also really wanted to look at and to start filling some of these huge data gaps in the Southern Ocean around heat and carbon fluxes at the surface. So this is probably one of the single biggest holes in our observational network is these fluxes at the surface. I haven't got a global map, but if you look at any measurements of heat and carbon flux into the surface, you have coverage everywhere except the Southern Ocean, with very few points, very few long-term points. So one of the things that we did in this project was install turbulent heat flux measurements on the front of the JCRs, the Bass ring or the UK research ship, which meant that these would be always on, even when you weren't doing a formal cruise, they were pretty much autonomous. And so we started filling in the starter deserts, at least in the summertime when the ship was there, with observations of the air-sea turbulent heat fluxes. And contemporaneously, you can see here, we also made the same measurements with the Bass aircraft. So on the panel on the right shows the flights looking at air-sea fluxes over different sea ice areas, and also some of these longer flights coming up to the north. Those were overlying the same places we deployed ocean gliders, so we had views from the ocean surface, from the atmosphere into the ocean, into the mixed layer, and beneath from the aircraft, wave gliders and subsurface gliders. And we also managed to get the ship and the plane in the same place at the same time occasionally, so we can make sure we can calibrate those two different observing systems. So that was largely that out of PML, so it's the Plymouth Marine Laboratory. One of the really nice results that came out of this was a paper by Ming Yan. He was effectively looking at the role of surface surfactants. So surface surfactants, this is where my lack of knowledge comes in, is effectively biological scum that sits on the surface layers of the ocean. And he's showing that these actually can have a really important impact on the gas exchange velocity, so how well gas is exchanged between the atmosphere and the immediate surface of the ocean. So sort of the hatched areas here show previous estimates of the efficiency or the gas exchange velocity coefficient, how well this transfers, as a function of wind speed. So as wind speed goes up, so too does the transfer efficiency. But what he showed in the red and the blue lines is when you have more surfactants, particularly in the presence of strong biological activity, you actually start suppressing the gas exchange to an extent that this is really noticeable and significantly different from when you have less surfactants in the red line. So this is really the first time this has been shown in the Southern Ocean that biological activity, of which we know there's a lot, particularly in the spring, can have some real measurable change and impact on how well gas, and particularly in this case CO2, is actually transferred from the ocean to the atmosphere. So as I was alluding to before, we did look at, we did several process studies, and so the results of these are still coming out. But on the left, this basically shows the track of a bunch of sort of subsurface gliders and ocean surface gliders immediately to the west of the Antarctic Peninsula. This basically is the southern Antarctic front. And so these were deployed over about 3 or 4 months, and they also had the aircraft overflights at a few points during their deployments. And these are bringing out some really nice results. I don't have them here, unfortunately. This has been worked out by Alex Greeley. I'm looking at how the mixed layer changes on very short timescales and short spatial scales in response to things like wind events, so particularly storms. So we had several storms go through. And the nice thing about these gliders is, unlike a ship, you don't have to pack up when there's a storm, you just keep on measuring. And you can really see things like the deep layer mixing, deepening in response to that, subsequently shoaling again. And also, you have lots of really good observations along the fronts in really high spatial resolution. You can start looking at how the whole frontal regions respond to these wind stress events, and also the role of the sub-meter scale, which is something you don't get from ships. Using very similar tools, but looking at a different process. This is the topography around sort of Discovery Bank, part of the South Scotia Ridge I was talking about before, and it's basically where you effectively have a mound sitting in the existing flow. So physicists might say they might enjoy the fact that there actually is a Taylor column that appears to pop up there, where you effectively get water rotating in a clockwise, anti-clockwise fashion here, around the Discovery Bank. And on the south side of that, the Weddell Sea, and on the north side is the Scotia Sea. And so one of the things we're quite interested in.
So, Andrew, you used the term Taylor column a few times. Could you expand on that?
So Taylor columns, this is where you really test my knowledge, but effectively, I'll describe it rather than try and describe it mathematically. If you have a lump of the bathymetry sticking up above a flat plane, and you have a current moving across that, what you end up getting an induced circulation, which extends not just around the base of the lump. So you can have a lump at the bottom of the ocean with quite a lot of ocean above it. But you'll actually get a column of rotating fluid which extends from the small bump on the bottom right up to the surface. And so that effectively you get a sort of circulation.
This is vortex.
Yeah, it's effectively a vortex around that. So it's sort of a classic tank experiment. You can put it in a rotating tank, have your circulation going, and put a bump on the bottom. There's some nice videos from MIT that show this, and then you can watch the circulation above that. So Mike Meredith wrote a paper in 2015 basically looking at the criteria that you would expect a Taylor column to emerge. And we basically looked at all the length scales and changed the height of these mounts around this sort of the South Atlantic, and said that Discovery Bank is a real prime candidate for the existence of a Taylor column. So what we did effectively was go out and make the measurements. So the stars, you can see this map, CTT deployments, where we basically map out the hydrography. But we've also deployed a bunch of EM8X floats, which I guess Helen can tell people more about. But these will effectively allow you to measure the velocities on a very fine scale, as well as track them in a Lagrangian fashion. And so what we found is that they did indeed move in a counterclockwise fashion around the Discovery Bank. We also deployed VMPs, which are vertical microstructure profilers, which allow us to measure the turbulence, the very fine scale turbulence around the base, so basically the vertical line from beneath the ship. And here we also found significantly enhanced mixing around the bottom of basically the telecom was intruding into the water column, showing that we actually also have enhanced vertical mixing as well. So this work is still very much on the way, but it's really nice examples of theory leading to observations which are now starting to sort of back that up. I'll skip over that just a second. If anyone's interested in isotopes, please come and talk to me in the interest of time. So Orchestra was a very observationally focused piece of work, but we also had fairly significant modelling efforts that went into it. So one of those was the construction of 1/12th degree regional ocean models, which allow us to test some of these ideas that were coming out of Orchestra. So this was one of two models. This was a Z-level model run by Dan Monday at BAS, basically looking at circulation around Antarctica and being applied to some of the ideas that were coming out of the observational aspects. One example of these is some work I was doing looking at convective diffusive processes, looking at how eddy stirring versus eddy mixing can change heat transport within the overturning circulation. So this is the work on the way. It's part of the highlights, so I won't go into too much depth there. But suffice to say, there's quite a lot of modelling, high-resolution modelling going on as part of Orchestra. The other part was looking at closest to the continent, so looking at that lower cell of the overturning. So this is a model that was of a similar scale, so 1/12th degree, but instead of Z levels, so the vertical layers being basically flat levels, this is a hybrid, so sigma Z, so sigma in at least the shadow layers means that it's following the terrain and allows you to get under the ice shelves where a lot of the important ice-ocean interaction and mixing goes on that drives the formation of Antarctic bottom water, which is presently very poorly represented in pretty much any Z-level 1 degree model of the climate scale. And so you can see on the left here the Z-coordinate map of the salinity beneath an ice shelf, and on the right the sigma Z version coming from this model that's being built by George Nurse and others at NFC, showing that you have a much better resolution. So this work is also ongoing, but effectively it's going to be used to test some of the observational ideas, which I'll get to, about bottom water formation and trends that we're seeing in the lower sea. And we also had some adjoint modelling. So adjoint models are quite clever pieces of models, a clever approach to modelling, which in a very simplified way sort of allow you to run models backwards to see what they're sensitive to. So effectively you can choose something in the model that you're interested in. And in this case it was looking at the heat content of the mixed layer in regions where mode intermediate water form. So these important layers that get heat deep into the ocean. And you would be choosing that as our control function. And then effectively allow the model to run backwards and tell you what surface or what boundary conditions these these objective functions are actually sensitive to. So whether or not changes 5 years ago upstream in the surface heat fluxes actually impact the heat content of the mixed layer 5 years into the future of the mixed layers in the formation sites. But the nice thing about these is you don't have to specify what boundary condition it is you're interested in. It basically gives them options to find out whether or not it's heat fluxes, changes in the wind stress, changes in precipitation, or even changes in your model initial conditions, because the model is basically optimizing around those. So it's quite a useful tool. It can be very hard to interpret in cases. But here's a nice paper from Emma Bowl that basically looked at what the mode water heat content was sensitive to. And she found this quite confusing map. But effectively there's a whole heap of processes, some more important than others. But it gives us a really nice way of then subsequently deciding if we want to do a more traditional forward model experiment where you take a control run and perturbations around that control run, what perturbations to actually make forward models, particularly high resolution ones, are very expensive. So you want to be pretty confident that the perturbations you're applying are going to give you a sensible answer, or a sense that's going to actually impact the area that you're interested So adjoint models give you a relatively cheap, they can be run fairly cheaply, approach to trying to understand, what processes you think are going to be interesting and important for your area of interest. I'm happy to talk more about that if anyone's interested. And we also looked at a couple of climate models. So we had a strong partnership with the UK Met Office, who build climate models, so they had these sets of models of theirs effectively. And one of the things that we found out that really affected the CMIP 5 model, so this is sort of the previous generation of climate models, was a strong SST bias. So in the Southern Ocean, the surface layer was much too warm, by several degrees in many cases. And so work that Orchestra did along with the Met Office was really found that there's actually quite a strong relationship between the AAPP model. So this is the atmosphere only, so the prescribed ocean. So effectively what we're seeing is a very strong shortwave flux bias. So there was too much shortwave heat effectively coming into the Southern Ocean. And this was very much due to some failures in the cloud physics. So the clouds were not effectively reflecting enough shortwave radiation, meaning too much got through the ocean, leading to surface heat flux biases. And so this is something that the Met Office has certainly taken some efforts to correct. And through their now CMIP 6 and future CMIP 7 models, have actually taken this on board and have corrected those crowd microphysics to some extent, and reduced that bias. It's still there, so it's not entirely shortwave radiation, but this is a really nice example of some of the Orchestra results being fed through to actual practical applications in running these climate models. And we also made several contributions beyond physics. It was a purely physical project, but we really sort of wanted to support a lot of the rest of the community. The is a very multidisciplinary research institute. So some work I did with Hugh Griffiths, who's a benthic pathologist, was really look at applying some of these projections from CMIP models. So this is on the panel on the left, looking at how changes in benthic, so sea soil bottom temperatures around Antarctica would impact species distribution. So he basically had a map of species and their present day preferred temperature, so the environments that they actually prefer to live in. And then we effectively ran their models forward and looked at how those distributions would change, because they're really dictated by the depth of the seafloor and the temperature. This is very simplistic, but effectively showed that around Antarctica, most of the rest of the world, creatures have the option of moving with latitude. As things warm up, they can move a few degrees further south or north and move with their preferred band, particularly up and down coastlines like South America. Around Antarctica, they don't have that option, and they're often very, very specialised creatures, really uniquely adapted to cold water environments. So if you're warm, but even by a small amount, they actually get really strong reductions in their preferred habitats. And so around Antarctica, something like 80% of species in the subpolar regions were losing significant parts of their habitat. And on the right was some work that we did along with some penguin ecologists, with a similar sort of thing, taking future projections from climate models and using that to interpret how king penguin feeding ranges would change. So a really common metric that is used commonly in ecology is using the SST contours, which you can measure those easily from satellites, and watch how those SST contours move. And that's a really strong proxy for the position of fronts, which are associated with vertical movement of water and nutrients and feeding areas. However, that's a relationship that decouples in the future. So it's good on short terms, but as you apply a climate trend, that decouples really strongly. And you can see the red line is basically the longitude of a single move in latitude by longitude of a SST contour. And you can see that the SST contour is places a long way south. So people would sort of naively say that the SSTs move south, the polar front and its associated dynamics and nutrient-rich areas has also moved south. But that doesn't apply. Those fronts are actually really strongly topographically pinned, and you find that the blue line is where the front goes. And on average, the front doesn't move very much. Statistically, across the ensemble, it doesn't move at all. So if you try and project feeding ranges based on SST into the future, you're not really measuring. You're measuring SST, which penguins may care about the actual temperature, but they're probably much more interested in the dynamics of the feeding changes in the feeding areas, which don't necessarily move. Yep.
So how about subsurface temperature? How about using subsurface temperature to track?
Subsurface temperature.
Is it expected that they would have this inaccuracy as well as SST, or not necessarily?
You would expect that because the southern ocean, or the Antarctic circumpolar current, where this is done, this is sort of following the subantarctic front, is very strongly vertically coherent. So pretty much any change, I mean, obviously there's a gradient in temperature with depth, but if you follow the SST contours of the surface, that's actually a really good proxy for the subsurface properties, which is why it works in the short term, because it is basically tracking the front with just the SST, because the whole thing's quite coherent vertically. But in the future, that's not necessarily the case. You can actually warm the top. We can warm the whole lot, but dynamically that front stays where it was. Okay, right, so, yeah.
Just one more question on that. You told us two slightly contradictory stories there, that the creatures are dependent on the temperature, and then that penguins don't care about the temperature.
Sure. So, so this is getting into the ecological side of things. So most of the creatures that I was talking about in the first part were benthic dwellers, and it comes with a really strong caveat: is temperature is absolutely not the only thing they do care about. But in at least a lot of the species cases, it is something they do care about. The ecologist who were doing this here was making a pretty large jump, and he really strongly outlines that in the paper that these things may adapt quite strongly, and they probably could live at high temperatures. They just choose not to at the moment. But if temperature is the primary determinant of what they care about, because we're talking about thousands of species, they will lose habitat. King penguins. I know very little about king penguins, but I suspect they don't care too much about 3 degrees of temperature and much more care about food. But that was actually a response to a paper that said the fronts are moving, and we said the fronts probably not moving. You need to be really careful of using SST as a proxy. Right, so this is talking about a few more in-depth case studies where I can actually talk in detail about things I do know about. This is probably, in my opinion, one of the most interesting things that's come out of ORCHESTRA. We have been monitoring the changes in the Antarctic bottom water volume, or at least the transport into the Scotia Sea. So Antarctic bottom water is formed very strongly around in the Rocky-Pilsner ice shelf here as a response to the local topography and winds and sea ice formation. But unfortunately, it's very hard to measure there. You can't get a ship in there with any sort of regularity, often not at all. But what we can measure with regularity is the outflow of these water masses through both the Orkney Passage and subsequently into the Scotia Sea and into the Weddell Sea along the A23 section. So what you see at the bottom is occupations of the A23 section since 1994, and where it gets dense is on the right-hand side is where ORCHESTRA is. So you're going from once occupation every 5 or 10 years to every year. And what we found there is that there is a really strong decrease in the lower Weddell Sea bottom water area, the deep water area. So this is the class of water that has flowed from the Weddell Sea into the Scotia Sea. And that volume has been trending downwards since first observations to about 2014, and then recovered. It was something that we suddenly saw because we actually had high resolution observations. There was actually intraannual variability in this trend. It wasn't just monotonically down. But after I wrote the paper, and I really recommend you write papers when you have exciting results, it immediately crashed again. So here's two observations subsequently. So that trend, that was a short blip, a short recovery, and it's on its way back down again. So you can see these are two lines. The SR4 in orange is in the Weddell Sea proper, and this is the southern part of the A23 section in the sort of the outflow parts of the Weddell Sea. And both of those show this really long trend over the last 30 years of significant reduction in volume. And if you look at other observations, you'll see that the bottom water area or volume had area sections in volume across the Weddell Sea has decreased by at least 30% over the last 30 or so years. So this work has been led by Shenji Zhu, a postdoc of mine, and he's really looking at how we can use this, or how we can attribute this change, so that the change is occurring over the entire Weddell Sea, and it's occurring very clearly in the A12 section, the SR4 section, A23 section, any of these repeat sections that we have. And although the observations are very sparse in time, until recently at least, they all tell the same story. This very deepest layer is reducing in volume. And the suggestion is that's because there is less Antarctic bottom water or high salinity shelf water formation, which is the precursor to bottom water that's formed over the shelf in response to brine rejection, and then subsequent flowing down the continental shelf into the Weddell Sea, where it entrains sort of ambient circumpolar deep water and forming this Antarctic bottom water class of water. And in the process, sequestering carbon and heat and all the other things we're interested in, like oxygen. And so what this change in volume at the very bottom layer has also shown is that a lot of the observed trends, so there was a paper that came out by Strauss a few years ago, which said the Weddell Sea is warming up, and it is. If you go out and measure it at any given depth, which is what you see on the left. This is 3 different hydrographic sections across the Weddell Sea in different areas, and it's the temperature trend. And you can see in pretty much every location, anything below about 500 metres of the immediate mixed layer is warming pretty significantly, and certainly statistically significant. But if you then look at the amount of that is driven by heave and the amount that's driven by the actual change of the water properties itself, so this is a separation but done by some guys about 30 years ago, one of them's in the room, you can see that almost all that change is actually attributable to in heave. And so what that basically means is the very densest layer at the bottom has shrunk in volume, and all the layers above it have sunk down. So the isopickles, so the layers of constant density, have deepened by several hundred metres in many places. But the properties on those isopickles, so the water itself, hasn't changed much at all, which is on the right. So there's generally much weaker trend. There is some, but really a lot of the trend in the surface or the mid-depths is being driven by the fact that the very deepest layer has thinned and everything is slumped down. If you go out and measure it, you're basically measuring the same water, but now it's a lot deeper than before, so it appears warmer. So a lot of that change that's being seen is not necessarily water mass is warming up, it's this very densest layer that's shrinking. And so we wondered why this is interesting enough, but why should that be the case? And so we went to the source, and the source is really hard to measure. There's no very few direct observations, and certainly time series over the last 30 years are really sparse. We have some collaborations going on with observations here that were made here, a lot through the ice shelf. So I'm trying to work out if there's a role for the ice shelf in this, and those are not super convincing. But where we did find nice relationships was changes in the wind and the sea ice concentration. So on the left here, in the colours, you see trend in the sea ice concentration around the winter sea ice concentration in front of the Weddell Sea, the Ronnie Pilsner ice shelf. And what you can see here is this really strong negative trend right in front of the shelf. And that's where usually in winter there's an open water linear. So linears are formed at areas where dense water is formed through ice formation. So ice is formed, dumps a hole into solids in the form of brine into the ocean. But in linears, that ice is then subsequently blown out to sea, like the Bailey Catabatic winds here. And so the water is kept open, it makes more ice, so it makes it very, very dense quickly. But what we see is that sea ice concentrations are actually, it's effectively, that sea ice area is being reduced. So sea ice is actually coming in there, and that is being driven on the whole by, you can see that there's a convergent trend. So these areas on the left panel is the sea ice convergence, and on the right is the wind, changes in the winds. So what we're seeing is winds are tending, so the winds there are actually northerly. They're heading north, they're blowing the sea ice out, but the trend is southerly, so they're coming less northerly. The ice is being moved out less, and so you're having an increase in sea ice concentration in those areas, actually. And that is then leading to less dense water formation. And so you can actually do this using a thermodynamic approach, so basically looking at sea ice convergence. That was sort of pioneered by Holland and Fox, so Paul Holland is part of the study. And it's showing that if you work out this, the sea ice convergence and the consequent changes in dense water formation coming from there, you're having a very strong reduction in dense water. Over the last 30 years, you have this downward trend. There is sort of a peak back up in the last few years. But effectively, the amount of dense water being formed in these areas as a result of sea ice, I mean, there's some caveats here. We don't know the sea ice thickness, which is a big caveat. There's not really a way of getting around that. But if you just go by sea ice areas, the amount of dense water being formed is being decreased over the last 30 years pretty consistently. You can follow that through with some back-of-the-envelope calculations suggesting, based on how much we know dense water, the ratios of dense water mixing with circumpolar deep water, we do come out with numbers that are consistent with the 30% reduction that we've been given. So the next question is, well, what's happening to the winds here? And that's really being driven. So we have this convergent trend in sea ice drift, and this red area here, the ice is effectively not being blown out as much, so more ice is there and you have convergence. And that in turn is being largely associated with changes in the Antarctic Sea low. So that's this sort of prevailing low pressure system here that sits over the Antarctic Sea and has and extends right over to the Weddell Sea. So as that has deepened slightly consistently over the last 30 or so years, that trend we're seeing, so too have the northerlies weakened, and you're blowing the ice out less, so you're leaving more ice there, less open water, less dense water formation, and subsequently less Antarctic bottom water. And at the moment we're having a strong internal discussion about whether or not this is something that's attributable to climate change, or whether or not it might be linked with the interdecadal Pacific oscillation. So this could conceivably be something like a 30 or 40-year oscillatory trend driven by changes in the Pacific, which would then drive 30 to 40-year oscillations in bottom water production, which is quite a tempting idea because a lot of models do have those sorts of oscillations, probably longer timescales, but conceivably there is some evidence to suggest that you do have longer-term oscillations in naturally driven oscillations in Antarctic bottom water formation. So this could be some sort of evidence pointing towards that. We don't really have any, that's pure conjecture at the moment, but it's something that we think is very potentially exciting. And I see I'm using up my time really rapidly, so maybe I'll move on across some of the other ideas that we were talking about of node water formation and properties in CMIP6, and move on to the other thing I'm supposed to be talking about today, which is ocean ice. So all that's in the past. Forget orchestra. What's the new coolness is looking at ocean ice interactions. So this is a project that's set up by Horizon Europe. So Horizon Europe is a consortium of all the European countries, which used to include the UK, which now does not include the UK, potentially, where they pool research funds, calls are put out, and in this case looking at how ocean ice interaction around Antarctica impacts the global climate. So this was the successful bid, and it will start at the end of this year, involving 17 centres, a reasonable amount of funding, and hopefully led by myself, if we can say that the UK is in fact part of the European Union where science is concerned. It's an interesting problem. But, the goal of this program is basically to look at how the ocean ice sheet in this case, so now we're looking at the proper ice sheet itself, feedbacks impacts the global climates on a wider scale. So it's sort of broken up into multiple work packages. Really, it's very Antarctic centric, but we are certainly looking at how that feeds through to the rest of the world and impacts society, or impacts the climate, but how that feeds onto society. So it's broken up into various work packages. Work package 1, where I'm sort of most comfortable, is looking at ocean processes around Antarctica. So this is the thing we're looking at in Orchestra, how heat is brought onto the Antarctic ice shelf, or the continental shelf, and how it interacts with the ice sheets. Work package 2 is very much focused on the processes of the ice sheet ocean interactions. So this is sort of circulation in those cavities, mixing at the base of the ice sheets, refreezing, and also things like iceberg formation. So a lot of the sort of basal melting we've been talking about in the past is purely melting at the base of ice sheets, but half the mass loss from Antarctica is driven by icebergs. And those are very poorly represented in climate models, and the distribution of that ice, how that melts subsequently, has a big impact on the ocean circulation. If you dump all that fresh water in one spot, it's a very different response to the ocean to if you distribute it widely across the Weddell Sea route. Then work package 3, so getting across the central area, is really looking at the Antarctic ice sheet as a whole. So trying to get a good handle on past trends, so doing reconstructions of what the ice sheet has done over the observational period, and then using that to start looking at the glacial mass balance in the present day, and then feeding into work package 4, which is really looking at uncertainties, how these ice sheets are going to change over the next 300 to 500 years. That's something we're interested in. CMIP tends to look on 100-year timescales, but really when you're talking ice sheets and their subsequent interactions, we need 300 to 500-year timescales. So we're really looking at uncertainty in how those ice sheets respond, for things like sea level rise, but also how that impacts ocean circulation So, you know, the canonical sort of tipping points is things like the Thwaites ice sheet, so the West Antarctic ice sheet collapse. So that's something that we're looking at and looking at risks around that. But also what happens if that happens? And even if it doesn't happen, how much of this freshwater melt we're getting from the ice sheets, how will that impact the ocean circulation? So that's work package 5. So the Antarctic is the southern limb of the global overturning circulation. It's the southern limb of the AAPP, which people in Europe particularly care about, the Atlantic overturning circulation. And lots of work has been done in the north, around Greenland, about how you can destabilise or stop the overturning circulation. But much less has been done in the south. What happens if you dump all of the West Antarctic into the Southern Ocean? How is that going to change the overturning circulation on these multi-centennial timescales? And also, how does that interact? Changes in the north feed through to the south. It's the source of this North Atlantic deep water. That deep water is what ultimately brings heat to Antarctica. So how do changes across this sort of north-south system that's driven by both the winds, but also there's two huge chunks of ice in the rim, how did that respond in the coming centuries to climate change? And then ultimately, how will these feed through to global metrics? So running coupled ice sheet climate models is sort of the real crux here. And ice sheet climate models traditionally do not include active ice sheets. It's a very hard problem, and it's something that they've just sidestepped for all modelling studies up until present. At the CNET level, so the international, the level of international intergovernmental climate change models, they don't include active ice sheets. So they melt at a prescribed rate, they don't respond to the ocean, they don't respond to the atmosphere. So the next big step in this sort of climate modelling is really including these coupled ice sheets. And so that's what this project is really doing, and taking these coupled ice sheets and saying, okay, well now they're coupled, and we'll make improvements around the boundaries, so things like iceberg representation. How does that impact the climate? And how does the Southern Ocean feedbacks, because these coupled models are interesting because they can feedback, how does that change the future trajectories of global climate? So that's boring. Research elements. So we'll be doing a large amount of modelling, but also in situ observations, and happily some partners around Australia and the rest of the world will be helping us to make those observations. So we're doing things like the Antarctic ice sheet mass balance. So that's really looking at how changes in, basically have the ice sheet mass balance, and doing large-scale modelling to try and get that as accurate as possible at the present day. So our colleagues in Gothenburg will be taking their fancy AUV, which is fairly analogous to the one that's operated here by Williams and others. I think it's still diagram. Yep. And taking that under and around Thwaites ice shelf, and particularly looking at, probably for the first time, how grounded icebergs interact and change the ocean circulation immediately around them. Because often these large icebergs don't snap off and float away, they snap off, move and ground, which intimately changes the circulation around them and potentially some of the inflow and outflow pathways for these water masses that impact the wider ice shelf. We'll be doing ice shelf borehole deployments. So we're doing these 2 deployments. The submarine is basically going into what are effectively warm ice sheets. So the ice sheet is in contact with sort of warm water from the Antarctic Circum Polar Current around the West Antarctic. And the boreholes will be in the East Antarctic, where you have cold ice sheets, where they're very strongly insulated with the Weddell Sea from the wider ocean. But those will be used to look at some of the dynamics of what's happening directly beneath the ice shelf, and in conjunction with moorings at the front. So we can see how the waters coming in are being subsequently modified and interacting with the base of the ice shelf, but also looking at really fine-scale processes such as the turbulence that occurs and is really responsible for delivering the heat as final few meters to the base of the ice shelf. As I mentioned before, we'll be using these sorts of models, the ice sheet balance models, to do hindcasts, trying to get the observations of the ice sheet mass balance to line up with what the model's saying. And that'll be done in conjunction with a lot of satellite observations. So bringing in the Earth observations, which is really the best way of looking at of ice sheet change, using the gravity emissions and others, to see how the ice sheet has been modified in the recent past, the last 30 years. And then there'll be lots of Argo deployments, and these will be what we might like to call mud Argo, where we basically drop these things off over the continental shelf. And Helen's done this as well. No, not Helen, Esme and Steve have been doing that. They've been putting them in over the continental shelf and using them as quasi-moorings. So they'll go down, but they'll be programmed to sink deeper than the seafloor. And they'll hit the bottom, hopefully not push too hard, and sit there for 10 days and then profile again. So you, instead of being a drifter, they're sort of a quasi-mooring. And they'll move slowly with time, but you can get a good measurement on under, in fact, the sea ice. So it's a nice way of looking at some of the, how these, what we sort of terming the sort of the heat gates, where you have strong interaction between the ice sheet and the ocean in a few point locations around the Antarctic. How that those properties are then propagated around the Antarctic and into some of the water mass formation sites in the bottom of them. So looking at how these areas communicate both across the shelf but also along the shelf, which is something of an unknown quantity but suspected to be very important, particularly around the Ross Shelf, where this sort of strong freshening signal from all the melt up here is coming into the Ross Sea and changing the stratification in bottom water properties. And then all that work will sort of feed into some of the more off-shelf work, further off-shelf work. So there'll be a lot of work done at improving our modelling of iceberg formation and sort of things like marine ice cliff instability. So some of the things like surface fracturing, so fracturing, and some of the more dynamic ice sheet collapse processes that are currently really not represented at all in climate models and poorly in ice sheet models. And then moving on to see how that, through using these models, which are actually interacting with producing icebergs coupled with the ocean, how that iceberg distribution impacts subsequent ocean circulation and heat delivery back to the ice sheet. And then some more observations looking at this bottom water problem that I've been alluding to in the orchestra, putting some moorings in a deep pathway in the South Sandwich Trench, which is actually where most of this bottom water goes. So the Orkney passage I was talking about before, where we had those nice downward trends and recoveries, that's actually probably only a third of the bottom water volume and the lightest class. So where the actual, all the rest of the Weddell Sea bottom water is going is currently completely unmonitored. So we'll be putting moorings out there. And then tracking that further north out to the Samba Array, which is this nice array that extends between Africa and South America, and it's been going for many years now, and that could be looking at how that's changing the bottom water properties there. We know that there is a downward trend, but it hasn't really been monitored in the long-term fashion. So there's lots of papers by Sarah Perky and others looking at this trend, but it's just from hydrography. There's no long-term deployments of moorings in these outflow regions. And then finally, we'll be using these experiments that I alluded to before, where we're looking at the ice sheet stability, looking at various tipping points and different climate change scenarios at 2300, and from those inferring probability distributions of ice shelf melt, calving and runoff, and then using those to define hosing experiments where we hose both the north and the south parts of the Atlantic, and start looking at really how that impacts this overturning circulation on multi-centennial timescales, but also how those ocean ice feedbacks modify what we're currently using to project the future, and how having an active interaction between the ocean and the ice can change our projections for sea level rise and global warming, particularly focused around Europe, because that's those are our key stakeholders, but the rest of the world. So thanks everyone. I know we've probably run wildly over time, but I'd really like to have a chance to talk to people about this and answer any questions in the last few minutes I have.
Are you watching the chat for me? Fantastic. That was fantastic.
Yeah, sorry, it's a lot to get through.
So, in the room, are there any questions while Weneka is checking? Will?
Yeah, so, stepping back some time,
Yeah.
you talked about the adjoint model.
Yes.
And, it seems like a really interesting approach, but you said that you can run those quite cheaply, but I've always thought, because it's a sort of iterative process, that the adjoint modelling is quite expensive.
You're right. Cheap is a relative term. I say cheap because it's a 1 degree model. It's a long way back, but it's a 1 degree model.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about expensive, we're talking about the 12th of a degree sort of whole Southern Ocean. So you can run the adjoint once it's all set up and it's actually working.
Yeah.
Relatively cheaply for those sort of 20-year timescales you might be talking about for a high reservation perturbation experiment. You run this. It's about 5 times, I think. Last time I spoke to Dan Jones about this. More expensive than just running a 1 degree model forwards.
Yeah.
So definitely more expensive, but the resolution is the orders of magnitude more.
Yeah, 1 degree nowadays.
Yeah, right. It's quasi-trivial.
Yeah. Cool, thank you.
Anyone else in the room? Whenever.
There's a question from Annalie online. She says, thank you, Andrew. Going back to ocean fronts, you explained how temperature contours don't work well on long time scales. What are good methods to identify fronts over a long time scale?
So over long timescales, so I think on the sort of 30-year timescales, the observational period, they're not too bad. SST is not going to steer you too far wrong. I mean, they have been. So you know what you should be using is sea surface height. I mean, there's a swathe of different ways of identifying where fronts are, and for different purposes, different approaches are useful. But sea surface height, you can't go too far wrong. And looking at sea surface height trends, and those are as good, at least as good. Those go back now 30 years, back to 1992 with the VSTO. So you can certainly use those to look at the recent sea surface height changes. I think most businesses wouldn't have a problem with that. Looking forward into the future, so if you're trying to look at interpret climate models, for example, you should be using pretty much the same sort of metrics. So sea surface height, or effectively the dynamic height from those models, or I guess more simplistically, frontal velocity will tell you where the fronts in the models are. I mean, you have to be careful with these models as well because they don't represent the same fronts that you see in the ocean. The ocean is really intensely filamentary, and the climate models are not. They just usually have one or maybe two cores that you call them fronts. So yeah, using SST in those models, you really need to look at the ocean velocities, or more properly, the dynamic height, and look at the gradients of those to see what the fronts are. Steep gradient, fronts become steep height gradients.
She's asking, what about gradients of these variables?
Gradients of what?
Of these variables.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Neither do I. Emily, if you can unmute, it'll be great.
Hi, I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Andrew. It's fine. I'm happy to catch up with you offline and chat about this.
Yeah, I'm here most of the day. I think I'm here at the afternoon tea for half an hour, and then I'll be back here for most of the afternoon. So
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you for a great talk.
Cheers.
Okay, any more questions from the room? Everyone's gone quiet. I have a slight regret here, actually. We have some of the ice shelves project made big here, but actually the entire structure of the program is not with this of the AAPP, and ACES in reality. Because the breadth you talked about in both notions and several years. So there's a lot of overlap actually in your talk with the program we have going on. So that's not a question, that's a comment. And let me, so if there are no more questions there, there's afternoon tea, morning tea actually. Andrew will be there. Let me thank you, Andrew, for what I thought fantastic talk. I've enjoyed that enormously, and I'd love the overlap. Look forward to collaborating on the EU, the Horizon Europe project, for which we are contributing. Actually, AAPP is contributing to that program. You saw the Aussie flag actually in Eastern Antarctica. It's a 4-year program. How many people?
So how many people is a little tricky. So this is what I've been doing for the last year. So there's about 800 person months. How many individuals? There's 17 centres. There's 17 leads of each of the centres. So probably about 40 people once postdocs are hired and PhD students delivered.
And the total value?
The total value is €8 million.
8 million euros. So smaller than the orchestra project.
And in practice, a lot smaller because orchestra give you ship free point of view. So if you ask for a ship and you win your science case, here's your ship free. The EU is not quite so generous, and so most of our ship work there is all beg to borrow. So we buy the equipment, so we beg time on ships. So in effect, there's a lot less effective logistical capacity.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Let me thank you very much, and there's morning tea.